actually working now. That's good. It wasn't working. I've been trying for a while to make this work. I'm glad it's working now. I'm just gonna start reading. Yeah, I'm just gonna start reading. Because we've not read in a while together. There it is. We're gonna read Ghost Bride again. Ignore the mannequin in the background. There we go. That's better. Okay. So, Ghost Bride. Been reading it. We're on part 4 now of me reading it. I don't know how much I'm going to read of it today, but it's, in case you can't remember what happened, the main character got told that she had to marry a dead guy and marry like his spirit and stuff, and then she doesn't really want to do that for, I think, obvious reasons, and she's now, her spirit is in the world of the dead or the undead or something. Wait, hang on. There's like a funky name for it. I can't remember what it's called. It's like the land of the dead, I think. Or something like that. Where is it? Afterworld. That's it. Yeah. Now she went into the afterworld, and now she's going to go to the planes of the dead so that hopefully her spiritual body can get back into her physical body, because her physical body is with her other body. Yeah. The first part is up on YouTube. I think the second part's going up. Is the second part already up? I think the second part might be already up. Give me a sec. Yeah, second part's up. Second part came out last week. And the third part will be up, not this week's video, but next week's video. So I'm planning on reading 5 chapters. There we go, 5 chapters. That sounds good. Yeah, I like the idea of that. Cool. Chapter 20. Fan ducked her head and slipped through the door. Even as I hesitated, there was no time to say another word. Far down in the depths of the doorway, I could see the glow of crimson light, but there was no sign of Fan. I took a deep breath and tightened my grip on Chandana's reins. As we passed through the doorway, the faint noises of the street vanished, and all that remained was a silence so profound that it felt as though my ears were ringing. It was like entering a tomb. Holding on to Chandana's mane, I groped my way forward. The ground beneath was smooth and flat, the darkness so thick that it clung like velvet, making it impossible to make out my feet. Far ahead, the red light glowed through it seemed to shed no illumination on anything else. Turning to see if I could find the way back, I was overwhelmed by the sensation of blindness. I was about to panic when I heard Fan's voice close at hand. "Well," she said impatiently, "shall we go?" "Where are you?" Fan's spirit light, which had announced her presence to me in the shop house, was indiscernible. "Can't you see me? I can see you quite clearly." "What does it look like to you?" I asked. "It's a tunnel, a passageway to the plains of the dead." "Is it lighted?" "Certainly. There are lanterns hanging from the walls." "Do you mean to say that you can't see them at all?" "No, only a faint red light in the distance." "How odd," said Fan. "Perhaps it's because you're not a ghost. I suppose you from the heavenly realm come here." "We're not accustomed to these conditions," I said, with some embarrassment at keeping up this pretense. "Well, at least you can see the end of the passage," she replied. "That light is the entry down to the plains." To me, the darkness seemed cold and dead, the light less like a welcoming beacon than a warning, a dull red eye staring unwinkingly from some far cavern. I hoped that the rest of our journey wouldn't suffer from this strange dichotomy, or I would make a very poor spy for Erlang. "Come along then," said Fan, sounding pleased with her advantage. "Can you follow me?" By following the sound of Fan's chatter and aligning myself with the faint light, it was easier to advance. I asked her to describe what she saw. "It's very grand," she said. "There are tiles underfoot, and the lanterns are of coloured silk." Despite Fan's lyrical description, the ground felt as though it was made of hard-packed dirt, and the air was still and breathless. I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were descending into a mausoleum. Only by lacing my hand in Chandana's mane could I force myself onward. She didn't balk again after that first refusal at the doorway, but walked quietly by my side. In this manner, too, she was unlike a real horse, but I was grateful for her company. "How do you find your way back?" I asked Fan after a while. "Oh, from the Plains of the Dead the passage is quite clear. You can't miss it. You just have to remember which door you came in." "Did you ever try to go out through the other doors?" "Once or twice. I know there are a couple of exits in Malacca. One goes to the merchant quarter. I don't know where the others go, though," she said carelessly. The merchant quarter was where my own home lay. I squirreled this information away with a sinking feeling, as I hadn't realised that getting out would be so difficult. Now it sounded as though I would need Fan's help more than ever, for Lang had said he could not come to this place. "We're almost there." I peered ahead at Fan's words. The light spread like a burning haze to my eyes, which had become accustomed to the dark, and I began to see what the walls of the passage were rough-hewn rock as was the floor, as though some giant creature had wriggled its corkscrew way through the rock. It was nothing like the genteel corridor that Fan described to me. As we walked around the final curving bend of the passage, the light became a blaze that momentarily blinded me, and at last I saw where the tunnel opened out. As far as the eye could see was a barren plain. It was so dry that the grass had shriveled into white stalks of dead vegetation, barely covering the crumbling earth, like a thin coarse pelt. Above it rose a burning sky. Accustomed as I was to the lush jungles of Malaya, I stared in wonder and horror at this wasteland. "You see what I meant by needing transportation?" asked Fan. Turning, I saw that she now appeared more substantial. Her skin was no longer shriveled, and even the details of her dress had taken on the appearance and weight of cloth. She looked out at the grassland with an incongruous expression of pleasure. "The first time I saw all these flowers, I thought it was paradise," she said. Clearly, things appeared differently to her. I kept my own observations to myself. Next to me, Chandana snorted and stamped a hoof. She didn't seem at all daunted by the endless stretch in front of us. "We should wait here for my servants to arrive," said Fan. "Whenever I get to this point, they eventually show up to escort me." "I suppose you could walk," I said. "Walk? There are settlements across the Plains of Dead, but they're very far apart." "And what do they look like?" "Towns, villages. They roughly correspond to the places above. There is a kind of Malacca, where you find those ghosts who used to live in there, and then there are the outlying villages. But the dwellings come and go as the ghosts move on the courts of judgment. It's always shifting." "And there are other towns too?" She shrugged dismissively. "I heard there was a ghostly Penang, and a Singapore too, but I don't know where they are." We gazed at the endless prairie in silence. Fan scanned the horizon from time to time and frowned. I had expected to find caverns, stalactites, stalactites, and dungeons. The accoutrements of an underworld such as I had been illustrated in painted scrolls. Nothing had prepared me for this. Despite the merciless glare, I couldn't see the sun. The sky was evenly lit, which gave it an artificial air, yet the overall effect was overpowering. With no landmarks, I had no way of knowing how many miles the grassland stretched out for, but it seemed like a great distance. After a time, I became aware of two dark shapes that drew steadily closer. Soon, a pair of coolies emerged from the long grass, carrying between them a shoulder pole with a basket slung under it. "There they are," said Fan. "My goodness, they look even worse than before." As they drew nearer, I saw what she meant. They reminded me of the servants in Lim Tian Ching's funeral mansions. But unlike Lim Tian Ching's servants, their eyes and noses were roughly shaped. The mouths made gashes in their lumpy faces. Their general appearance was much faded and worn, and the contrivance they carried looked decidedly rickety. When they reached us, they bowed stiffly and dropped the basket to the ground. Fan climbed into it with some reluctance. "It's such an uncomfortable mode of transportation," she said. "If only my father hadn't been so stingy with me." I refrained from pointing out that she was much luckier than the hungry ghost, who had nothing at all. "Well, shall we be off then?" she asked. Her porters picked up the carrying pole and hefted it briskly onto their shoulders. Then, without a backward glance, they set off in their burning grassland. Swinging myself onto Chandana, I followed after. My horse was faster, so I held her back, which also relieved me from Fram's constant conversation. Glancing at her swinging awkwardly in the basket, however, I couldn't help feeling sorry for her. It seemed like a most uncomfortable mode of transportation to be tossed to and fro like a load of vegetables. From time to time I caught a glimpse of her white hand as she smoothed her hair, petting it as though it were a live animal. Turning back, I noted that the passageway we had come from emerged from a range of hills. They were rocky and bare of vegetation, coloured a deep oxblood red. It was an awe-inspiring yet dispiriting sight. There was not an insect or a bird that I spied along the way, and no flowers bloomed in the withered grass. It seemed impossible that rain ever fell on the desolate land. If I had been made of flesh and blood, I would surely have been burned in that ferocious light. Still, I wished I had a hat, and I had to improvise by pulling part of my pyjama jacket over my head. As I did so, I felt the scale in my pocket that Li Lan had given to me. I was tempted to examine it again, but I didn't wish to draw Fan's attention. From time to time she glanced back, and her eyes were hard and bright. We travelled for what seemed like hours. The glare began to fade from the sky until it was suffused with a curiously beautiful violet colour. Urging Chandana forward to draw level with Fan, I asked, "What happens at night?" "Oh, we just keep going," she said. "I usually try to get this part of the journey over as soon as possible." It was easier for her, I realised, for despite the jolting motion of the basket, all she had to do was allow her porters to bear her tirelessly along. No doubt my little horse could walk all night, but I was afraid that I might fall off it if I fell asleep, and I said as much to Fan. She frowned. "I hadn't thought of that. I suppose we can stop and rest if you like." We made a makeshift camp in the grass. I had experienced neither thirst nor hunger since we had entered the plains of the dead, but despite that I felt weary with a sense of being stretched out even thinner. Alighting stiffly, I walked around, stretching my arms until I noticed that my feet scrunched on the coarse dry earth and the grasses parted their bleached heads for me. For the first time in a long while, I had a physical impact on the world around me. Instead of relief, however, this discovery filled me with dread. I didn't want to belong to this world. I wanted to go back to Malacca. My living, breathing Malacca, with its humid air and torpid days. Fan watched as I paced up and down. She had climbed out to her basket-like contraption and was now rearranging her hair, which, like the rest of her, seemed to have become more substantial than before. "What are you looking at?" she asked. I made a non-committal noise and she fell silent. After a while, however, she said in a low voice, "I know you see differently than I do. What is it really like?" In the growing darkness, her face was a pale blur. "Why do you want to know?" I asked. Her voice faltered. "Sometimes I have a feeling that things aren't what they seem, and I'm frightened of what comes next. If my lover doesn't die with money, or if he doesn't share it with me, then I must pass on the courts of hell." She seemed so downcast that I couldn't help feeling sympathy for her. "But after the courts is rebirth," I said. "You might find happiness again." "Oh, rebirth isn't the problem," she said peevishly. "It's what comes before. I'm afraid of the punishment for sins incurred in this life." "You were young when you died. Surely they won't judge you too harshly." Fan looked away. "I've overstayed my time in the afterlife. That's why I told you I seldom come to the plains of the dead anymore. Even though I ought to, I'm not like you." She cast an envious glance at me. "In the shop house I only receive those offerings to the hungry ghost that my lover puts out, but he burns no clothes, no shoes. I have to come back here to get what I can." "Why don't you ask him to burn funeral goods for you in his dreams?" "When we're together, I don't want to remind him that I'm dead. That would spoil everything." A pang struck me, for hadn't I made exactly the same decision about Tian Bei? After all, the thought of embracing a corpse was hardly conducive to romance. And besides, he might exorcise me. She made an impatient noise. "All these years I've been careful to make him think he's only dreaming when he's with me. I didn't want him to find out that I was really haunting him." "How do you think he would react? He's so concerned with his health. A monk would have told him that I was sucking his life force out." "And were you?" "Of course not," she said. "Well, maybe a little here and there to supplement myself. He looks quite good for 57, don't you think? 57? I had thought the old man was in his 80s at least. No wonder Fan was in such terror of the authorities. I had thought it a simple case of overstaying, but clearly she had been involved in other trespasses. She turned a guileless face to me. That's why I decided to come with you. If you're from the heavenly realm, you should be able to help me with the authorities. Uneasily, I wondered what else Fan had concealed from me. Just then she gave a cry and flattened herself against the ground. Looking up, I saw a swift dark shape passing overhead. What is it? Down, down, she hissed. I threw myself on the coarse earth beside her. Whatever it was swooped over us, dipping and wheeling with a mauling wail. It was a sound like nothing I had ever heard, piercing and forlorn, yet dreadful in its intensity. Stifling the urge to bury my face in my hands, I glanced up furtively, but the creatures were too fast. All I could see was that they flew strangely, as though they sheared the fabric of the air with sharp triangular wings. They passed ominously low. Squeezing my eyes shut, I flinched as the wind from their passage flattened the grass around us. An instant later they had lifted off and were gone, flying rapidly into the inky veil of night. After a time I sat up, but Fan remained face down on the ground, trembling and shaking. What were those creatures? I asked Fan. She was silent for a while, but at last she said, Most ghosts ignore them, but I heard that they may be spies for the courts of hell. I thought this was a place for human ghosts. It is, though the border officials sometimes cross into here, but nobody really knows whether these flying creatures belong to them or not. The border officials can come here? Horrified, I've been under the impression that non-humans could not. Yes, but they seldom do, Fan spoke in a low voice. There are many things here that I don't understand. That's why I asked you earlier what you saw, because surely your view of this place is different from mine. Even as Fan pressed me to tell her how things appeared to me, some instinct warned me against it. She was not so easily put off, however. Why won't you tell me? She asked, returning to her old petulance. It was as though that moment of vulnerability between us had never been. At length she gave up and lay down next to her porters. They hadn't flinched when those creatures had swooped down upon us, remaining as inanimate as the basket that lay between them. Chandana had at least snorted once, but she too hadn't seemed unduly troubled. I reminded myself that my little horse was, after all, not a creature of flesh and blood. It was a sobering thought, but did not prevent me from huddling next to her and falling asleep. Chapter 21. I was awoken by the gradual lightening of the sky. Just as the day before, there was no sun, merely a slow change in colour as though a screened backdrop was rising upon a stage. A breeze rattled through the dry grasses, and once again I was struck by the utter lifelessness of the plain. Not far away I could see Fan lying on her side, her eyes open. I wondered whether she had slept at all that night. I was glad, however, of the rest, even as I worried about how my physical body fared, far away in the world of the living. If something should happen to it, there would be any sign to warn me, or perhaps I would be cut off wandering forever in the sea of endless grass. As soon as we were ready, Fan gave the order to her porters to start moving. We're almost there, she called back to me. I urged Chandana a little forward. How do you know this? Oh, it's a feeling that I have near the cities and towns. It's like a pool. But I don't see anything ahead. Fan laughed. She seemed to be in a much better mood than the previous day. It doesn't work like that. The towns appear at their own pace. That's why I need my servants to find them, and that's also why the hungry ghosts could never come here, because they have no funeral offerings to guide them. Looking back, I could see that we had left the rocky hills where the passageways emerged far behind us. Instead of towering in the background, they were now mere bumps on the horizon. I was surprised at how much ground we had covered. In the real world, a journey of 6 or 7 hours could hardly have served to distance ourselves so far. It made me anxious, too, about how time was passing here. There it is. Ahead of us was a faint shimmer that became more substantial as we drew nearer. The haze thickened around us until I began to see the outline of streets and buildings filling in as we went forward, so that the road we were travelling became a broad avenue. There were shops and conjunctions of buildings that looked uncannily familiar. Down a side street, I caught a glimpse of what looked like the Stadthies, and from another, a brief view of a harbour lined with old-fashioned junks and frigates. It was beginning to look a lot like Malacca, but far larger and devoid of the debris that often lined the streets. Some buildings were missing, while others were replaced by gaudy monstrosities. The streets were silent and wide. The only people I saw were figures passing at a distance. "Where is everyone?" I asked. "There isn't a large population," said Fan. "Ghosts are always leaving when they're called to the courts of hell." She turned to me. "What do you mean to do now?" I told her that I had some tasks to do, keeping the details as vague as possible. I was afraid that Fan would insist on accompanying me, but she seemed disinterested, telling me only that she meant to go to her house. "A shack is more like it," she said. "Can you give me some money now?" I had prepared myself for a request like this once we had arrived, and gave her 2 strings of cash and some ingots, retaining a little for emergencies. "Is that all?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "I'm afraid so." "Oh, well, thanks, I suppose. Do you need me to show you the way back afterwards?" "Yes. How long will you stay?" "I think about 10 days. I have some housekeeping matters to attend to." "If you show me where your house is, I'll come to you to noon on the 10th day, or else send a message." "If you don't come, I may leave without you. I dare not stay too long here." I agreed to this, and in surprisingly short order we arrived at our house. The twisting streets loomed out the haze, winding haphazardly, making me afraid that I would be unable to find my way back. When I expressed this to Fan, she merely laughed. "That's why we have servants. The buildings change when inhabitants leave, and new ones come with their own funeral offerings. Your horse will remember the way." She drew to a halt. "Well, this is my place," she said. It wasn't as bad as she had made it out to be, though dark and shaped like a box. I guessed that it must have originally been a simple paper model. Fan invited me in, but I declined. Somehow I did not like to pass through that narrow door. "Why don't you stay with me while you're here?" she pressed. In the end, I put her off with some vague words. Fan's naked agendas gave me an uneasy feeling, and I already regretted the few pieces of information I had let slip. After leaving Fan, I let Chendana wander through the streets for a while. As we went along, I kept looking for familiar markers. Remembering the glints I had seen of the Stadthies, I thought that if I could find it again, I would surely have a better sense of where I was. The map that the Dutchman had drawn for me of the town was still impressed upon my mind, although I didn't know whether that was due to his clarity or some other reason. At last I saw the Stadthies, but, try as I might, could not approach it. Despite glimpsing it at the end of several streets, as soon as I went down them, it disappeared. Only upon looking back did it reappear like a mirage, around a corner at the end of an alley. Frustrated, I thought to ask some of the pedestrians I saw at a distance. I drew near an ornate palanquin, but the shutters were drawn and I hesitated, remembering my glimpse of Lim Tian Ching on the streets before and how he had such a conveyance while I stood there wavering. The shutters twitched and a shriveled face appeared. "What do you want?" he said. "A young girl going about alone? What is your family thinking?" I could only stammer before this onslaught, but the old man pried open the door and climbed out. "Recently dead, are you?" he asked. He was a wizened creature, bent with age. At the end of his scrawny neck, his head bobbled like a fishing weight, yet he was surprisingly agile, circling me with interest. "Good horse," he said. "They don't make them like that any more. Now it's only cheap paper, not even cardboard." "I beg your pardon," I said. "I just wanted to ask for directions." "Where do you want to go?" "I was trying to get to Stadthies." He snorted. "The Stadthies? It doesn't exist here." At the surprise on my face, he burst out into a cackle of laughter. "You can see it because it exists as a collective memory. All of us who lived and died in Malacca expect to see the Stadthies and the clock tower, but you can't visit it because nobody actually burned a funeral copy of it. Tch! I should have told my grandson to burn me one. Then I would be the sole proprietor. But you, young lady, what are you doing by yourself without your servants? Who is your family? Where do you live?" Despite his peculiar behaviour, I wondered if he might have seen some useful information, so I said, Oh, grandfather, I was just wondering where everything was. I'm so new here, you see. Ask away, but in return you must tell me something about yourself. It's only fair that I get some entertainment out of this. So do the areas here correspond to the real Malacca? Of course they do, or almost nearly, but distance is very deceptive here. He smiled cunningly. You can spend days getting to some places and only minutes to reach others. It has to do with how things are connected to one another. Everything is relational here. Your house, your servants, your clothes, they all depend on someone else's filial devotion to you. Look at me. When I died, I had nothing to want for. Some of my descendants even went to the temple to pray that I would have a long and extended time to enjoy these riches. But you see what happened? I jumped as his voice rose, and in the distance I saw several passer-by quicken their steps to avoid us, wondering whether I'd had the misfortune to run into a madman. I took a step back. I got stuck here for years. He let out a howl of indignation. Can you imagine that even my great-grandsons have died and passed on to the courts of hell already? His eyes snapped back to me. Now, why do you want to go to the Southys? I was just curious, I said. When I was alive, I was never allowed out of the house. He seemed satisfied by this, so I pressed on. Did you say that the family mansions correspond to the same areas as they did in life? Yes, by and large, although there are some who were poor in life but were assiduous about burning funeral offerings, so that they're now rich in the afterlife. But as soon as someone departs for the courts, when their possessions here vanish as well. Were you planning on visiting someone? I couldn't resist the temptation. I had a friend who was married to the Pan family and had a young daughter, but she died soon after. An old merchant family. I don't recall anyone from there recently. My face fell, and he gave a dry cackle. Don't give up hope. The womenfolk are often secluded. She may yet be there. I think they have one or two houses still in the merchant quarter. I cast my eyes down to hide the sudden beating of my heart. Was it possible that my mother was still here? A shiver ran over me, rendering me deaf to the old man's querulous voice. I said, "How did you die?" he repeated. "I want to know all about you. So young and pretty." The loose skin on his throat trembled like a turkey's wattle. "I fell," I said hastily. "It was dark and I slipped on the stairs." He looked disappointed. "Did anyone push you?" "Perhaps. My cousin was very jealous of me. We were both interested in the same young man." I hurried on, describing the horse-faced girl to him and the paroxysms of jealousy we had suffered over an unnamed Bilbouet. That at least was true enough. Part way through I paused. Are all the old Malacca families represented here too? Yes, even some whose line has already died out. He named a few and I listened carefully, satisfied when I heard him mention Lim. So it would probably be fairly easy to find Lim Tianqing's abode. Go on then, said the old man with a leer. Tell me about your cousin. Did you fight with her? I thought quickly. Oh yes, we really set to it one day. We rolled round on the bed and tore each other's clothes to shreds with our teeth. But tell me, now that we are here in the plains of the dead, does anyone have special escorts? I heard that you could bribe the border officials. My voice faltered, fearing I was asking too many questions. Nonsense. Nobody can bribe the border officials. He regarded me with suspicion, so much so that I hastily took my leave. Even then, he pursued me down the length of the street before I managed to shake off the lecherous creature. The old man had appeared harmless, almost mad in fact, but I wondered uneasily whether he had merely been toying with me. Well, there was no use fretting over it, and at least I had a good idea where Lim Tianqing might be found. After backtracking for a while, I headed towards the merchant quarter. That was where the Lim mansion was, and, likely, some semblance of my own ancestral home as well. Almost angrily, I debated with myself. Time was short, and I really ought to go to the Lim mansion. Yet I hesitated, thinking of my mother's face, a face that I had dreamt of often but could never recall. She had never had her portrait painted while she was alive. It had been so long since she had left me that I no longer knew whether the memories I had of her were my own or merely conjoined from tales told by Amma. I turned Chandana's head toward my own neighbourhood. I would pass by and see what sort of dwelling existed here. It wouldn't take long, I told myself. Just a few moments, that was all. The streets became increasingly familiar in a strange way, parts of them looking nothing like what I remembered, yet there was a spatial recognition, some trick of proportion that sang out to me. In some places, where there ought to have been buildings, there was nothing but old trees and rocks. In others, there were 3 or 4 fine dwellings occupying the same spot, and, of course, everything was much further apart, as though the original streets had been stretched to twice or even thrice their width and length. On one corner, which in the real Malacca held only the shell of a decaying house, there was a grand mansion. From behind the imposing gates came the faint sound of laughter and a woman's voice. I shuddered as I passed. Despite the gaiety, I couldn't help remembering what the house looked like in the living world, with its roof fallen in and the wild grass breaking up the cracked stone floors. There had been tales about the house ever since I was a child. Some said that a plague had killed all the inhabitants. Others that the last master of the house had gone mad and butchered his wives and concubines, laying their bodies out in the courtyard until the stones ran purple with old blood. As a child I had avoided that house, my head full of frightening tales told by Amma. Now, seeing it as it might have been in its days of glories, I felt terrified yet drawn to it. What would happen if I knocked upon those doors? With an effort I pulled myself away. Curiosity was my besetting sin, I told myself. As we reached the corner before my house, my throat tightened. Something whispered to me that if I wanted to remain among the living, these things were better left unknown. Yet I pressed onward stubbornly. I wanted to see my mother. How wrong could that be? At first glance, the curving wall that surrounded our house looked exactly the same, but when I reached the front I had a surprise. There were 3 houses on the site. Each house occupied the same space with no overlap. I stared until my head began to swim. It was some trick that I could not fathom, yet no matter how I peered from the corners of my eyes, I still saw 3 dwellings. The first was a grand mansion, somewhat in the style of our home in Malacca, but far more imposing. The ponderous front doors were twice the height they should have been, and from behind the serried, walled courtyards I could see the upper balconies rising like monoliths. It was as though my home had, in some nightmarish manner, grown like a fungus overnight. Despite the size and splendour, there was an air of decay about it, as though it had begun to crumble from within. The second house was a medium-sized abode in far better condition. It was like a child's drawing of a house, serviceable and sturdy, but with no pretensions to grandeur. The third was barely a house. It was very much like Van's dwelling, a little box crudely made and roughly finished with a narrow door and mean dark windows. I hesitated before my choices, then dismounted. The second appeared the most welcoming, so I walked up to its front door. As I did so, the other houses melted away in the periphery of my vision. I knocked, but there was no answer. Just as I tried again, I heard a harsh voice call from the side. "What do you want? She's gone, and good riddance too." Chapter 22. I peered at the door and windows, but the voice called out to me again. "Here, on the other side." Obediently I retreated until the trio of houses appeared again, and then I saw her. Leaning out the narrow doorway of the smallest house was the frowsy elderly woman. Like Van, she too wore funeral attire, though her clothes were faded and worn. Her cheeks, once plump, had fallen into hanging pouches, and 2 lines were etched disagreeably from the corners of her nose to her mouth. Her eyes, however, were sharp, stabbing into me like embroidery needles. "Are you talking to me, Auntie?" I said politely. "Whom else would I be talking to? If you're looking for her, she's long gone. Who lives in this house?" "I don't know." "You don't know, and yet you go knocking on doors?" "I was seeking a friend. Someone said she might be living in this quarter." The woman looked at me contemptuously. "I don't believe you." My face burned. "If you don't wish to help me, I'll bid you good day then." I began to retrace my steps, fuming at her rude behaviour. Why did ghosts behave like this in the plains of the dead? They seemed to have forgotten every civility, the genteel codes of respect that bound our society. "Huffy, aren't you? I didn't say I wouldn't help you, just that I don't believe you." "What don't you believe? That you're looking for a friend." "A friend, when you're the spitting image of her." I turned in surprise. "Who are you referring to?" Why, that hussy, that whore. The woman disengaged herself from the doorway and took a few steps towards me. Her frame, once large and heavy, now sagged as though it had been stuffed unevenly with lumps of hard cotton. Surprised? She asked. You never would have guessed from the way she looked. Daughter-in-law of the Pam family, indeed. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. The woman ignored me, her words spilling from her as though they had been pent up for decades, as, indeed, they might have been. Coming here to look for your precious mother, is that right? I'm sure your father told you nothing but good things about her. He was always a weak, foolish boy. I flinched as though she had slapped me. How quickly she had penetrated my anonymity. I know all about you, she said, a thin smile stretching her lips. Even when you were in the womb, I'm your grandfather's third concubine. You should be addressing me as grandmother, or haven't you any manners? She drew closer and I stepped back. It wasn't easy being the third concubine, you know. The other women in the household were so jealous of me when he brought me in. Not his wife, she'd given up by then. But the first and second concubines made my life miserable. But all I had to do was get a son by him. His other sons had died except for your father, and I knew what he was, weak. She stopped for a moment, regarding me with a triumphant air. I blurted out, I don't think I've ever heard of you. It was quite possibly the worst thing I could have said. If she had been irritable before, she was absolutely enraged now. What did I mean? I had never heard of her. How dare I disrespect my ancestors? I retreated down the path, beaten back by her vitriol. But seeing that I was about to leave, she mastered herself into some semblance of reason. Oh, but I have so much to tell you, she said. Don't you want to know more about your mother? At this I stopped, hating myself at the same time for falling for her tricks. At least you should have the courtesies to stop a moment instead of running off with no manners. The problem with the dead was that they all wanted someone to listen to them. Each ghost I had encountered had a story that was only too ready to share. Maybe it got lonely in the afterlife, or perhaps those who lingered longest were the ones who could not bear to give up. Something told me that I might regret listening to this woman, but I couldn't help myself. What is it you want to tell me? Changed your mind, then? She smiled unpleasantly. Well, some company is better than none, I suppose. Your family has neglected me shamefully. I still get little stipend now and then when they burn incense for the ancestors, but it's not very much, is it? She gestured to the mean little house behind her. And your grandfather promised to bury me in the family lot, but I showed him. I got my revenge even from beyond the grave. What are you talking about? I've been waiting for years for someone else from your family to come along, the last person with your mother, but then she wouldn't talk to me afterwards. She darted a swift glance at me. I came to see my mother, I said. If she's gone, there's no reason for me to stay. Oh, but she's not gone far. Don't you want to find her? I had assumed my mother had passed on to the courts of hell, but the woman was smiling again. Sit down, she said. I want to tell you a story. You have to understand that I wasn't always so unpleasant to look at. Once I was a fresh young girl like you. Pretty enough for your grandfather to choose as a concubine, though I was just a servant at the time in his friend's house. Your grandfather didn't know that I had already a secret lover, the second son of the house. When I became pregnant, I thought my lover would surely marry me or take me as a concubine. But he abandoned me. He wanted someone better. Oh, I was filled with grief and jealousy. Who was it, this woman who had stolen him from me? A young lady, he said, daughter of the Li family, not a servant like me. I winced, recognising my mother's maiden name, and the woman laughed. I see you understand where this is going. My lover made me get rid of the baby. He said that she would never marry him if he had a bastard. Do you know what it's like to have a child torn from your body? I screamed so much that I couldn't speak for days. After it was over, my lover arranged for me to become your grandfather's concubine. The old man was besotted enough. Kay! The old man was besotted enough not to notice I wasn't a virgin. I didn't want him, but I had no choice. But my lover didn't get... Yes! So sorry. Didn't get what he wanted either. Your mother turned him down. She wouldn't marry him. Oh no, he was only the second son after all, so he married her cousin instead. By the time I had other troubles, all I needed was a son to secure my position, but I couldn't get pregnant again. I thought maybe your grandfather was too old, so I decided to get a child by some other means. Your father was a handsome young man then, but no matter what I did, he ignored me. Finally, I cornered him, but the fool only stammered and wept. He was in love with someone else. Of course, it was your mother. How do you think I felt then? That woman took everyone from me, one after the other. The old concubine's face was raw with emotion. Shame burned my cheeks. I didn't want to hear any more, but I was frozen. She married him. Why not? He was the only son of a rich family. That snake pretended she knew nothing of what had happened, but I wasn't fooled, and I still couldn't get a child. I wanted a baby, my baby, that I had lost to the abortionist. I couldn't bear it. Her voice rose in a howl, so painful that I cringed, but she hissed at me. One day I brushed past her on the upper landing. She put her hand over her belly, and I knew. Your father was behind her, and he said with a foolish smile, "We're having a baby." I couldn't control myself. I flew at her, and we struggled on the stairs. In that instant, your father lunged forward and grabbed her. She was safe. I fell all the way down and broke my neck at the foot of the main staircase. Oh, you needn't look so horrified. I'm sure nobody in your household ever mentioned this to you. They said it was an accident, but if your father hadn't brushed past me to snatch her back, maybe I wouldn't have fallen. They made a hasty funeral for me. Your grandfather burned some grave goods, but after a year or so he simply stopped. So you see, I had plenty of reasons to be angry with your family. The first few years after I died, I spent all my time spying on the world of the living. I passed through the house so often that in the end they exorcised me. There was a cook who could see ghosts. He was the one who went to the master and said that my unquiet spirit was in the house. So I had to come back here, to this hovel in the plains of the dead. And I waited. I was young when my life ended. Only 21, the same age as your mother. I know, I don't look like it anymore. That's because I traded it. There are ways to get around everything. I found a demon who ate the essence out my spirit body, and in return he sent the smallpox to your house. Your mother and grandfather succumbed quickly, though your father survived. Can you imagine the looks on their faces when they arrived here and found me waiting? But they didn't stay. No, they didn't. Your grandfather was only here a few years, and then he was called on to the courts for judgment. And your mother? Well, she stood around, but can't bear to live in the house your father burned for her. Never accepts her spirit's offerings, or anything like that. She's gone to be a whore in someone else's house. Anything to get away from me. I'm going to go grab my tea. I'll be 2 seconds. And then we'll carry on because that's intense. I'll be back. Hello, I'm back. Let's carry on. There was a dull pain in my chest, a squeezing breathlessness. My head rang with the echoes of her story. I wished I'd never gone to look for my mother. All I had found was a monstrous tale of old sins and deep bitterness. With difficulty, I controlled my voice. Why didn't you send the smallpox to your lover? Who made you lose your child in the first place? She lifted her brows. It's none of your business what I chose to do. In the end, everyone who's ever crossed me will pay for it. You're upset about your precious mother. Well, let me tell you just where she went and what a good, kind person she is. Instinctively, I shrank back. That's right, she said. When I told her what I'd done, she went straight off to the household of my lover. Oh, he's not dead yet. In fact, he's still in the world of the living. She probably thought I deserved whatever I had suffered at his hands and went to live with his family. No doubt to plot some revenge against me. That's where she is, a kept woman in the Lim mansion. I had thought that nothing she said could shock me more than her earlier revelations, but I was wrong. The Lim family? That was your mother's revenge on me, stupid woman, as though I care what she does with herself. She opened her mouth as though to unleash another tirade, and for the second time that day I fled. The Lim family, all paths led back to their door. Our destinies seemed darkly tangled, and for the first time I considered the burden of the Buddhist wheel of reincarnation. Groaning beneath its weight, individual lives were forced to play out a fast time and time again. The image of the Anglican church in Malacca rose before my eyes, together with its green and quiet graveyard. When I died, I thought I would rather rest there undisturbed than continue like that old concubine, eaten up by her schemes of vengeance from beyond the grave. But what did I really know about anything? My world had been turned upside down. Chapter 23. Much more perfect. Cool. For some time I let Chandana wander at will, not caring what path she chose. I clung to her back, hugging my thin pyjama top and wondering how this dead version of Malacca had become so cold. A breeze blew uneasily, at first barely noticeable, but over time wearing down my defences until I shivered uncontrollably. Little things began to fall into place. I remembered Madame Lim telling me in her soft voice when I first went to their house that she and my mother were cousins of some sort. The general air of gloom in our family, which I had attributed solely to my mother's death, must have been held lingering echoes of the death of the third concubine. Old Wong and Amma's dislike of our main staircase, and everyone's reluctance to speak of the past. I remembered the pitying glances of our other Ammas when Amma took me out as a child. Now it occurred to me that may have seen me as an unlucky creature, born of a household plagued by ill fortune. As for the third concubine's lover, I had little doubt as who that might be. Lim Tek Yong, father of my tormentor Lim Tian Ching, and false friend to my father. It seemed that he had never ceased meddling in our affairs. Tears streamed from my eyes and dried in the wind. I didn't know what felt sorrier for, my father's years of Greece, the unmasking of my childish fantasies, or even the third concubine's wasted life and her wicked schemes. All I could fix upon now was to go to the Lim family mansion in this ghostly world. There I must surely find some of the answers to my questions, and I might see my mother, although I began to dread that meeting. The kind, gentle mother that Amma had fostered in my blurred memories might turn out to be another virago. My visit to the third concubine had consumed almost all the daylight, and the drop in temperature seemed to correspond with the number of figures of the dead that I had glimpsed, hurrying here and there on the gloomy streets. These bleak emanations might have stemmed from the ghosts themselves, for there had been little evidence of such a chill upon the grasslands the night before. It was as though, with the dimming of the light, the icy breath of the grave grew stronger. I now had a good sense of where the Lim mansion might be, and Chandana set off a brisk trot. We passed through endless streets and wide boulevards, far more than the real Malacca was possessed. The distance was interminable, the rows of darkened houses eerily expectant. At last we drew up in front of an imposing gate. If I had thought that any of the homes in my family's ghostly neighbourhood were grand, this put them all to shame. A great wall, almost 10 feet high, surrounded it. The doors alone were massive, yawning upward into dark shadows that were barely pierced by a pair of gate lanterns. This was no mansion. It was an estate. For long moments I hesitated, struck by the sudden fear that the gates would be manned by more ox-headed demons. But then I remembered that fans said they rarely came in Bahia, and I plucked up my courage. At worst, it might be no more than one of those silent automatons. I stood off Chandana's back and let the great iron door knocker fall with a clatter. There was a long silence as the echoes died away, then slowly the great gates opened. A pale face appeared. It was a manservant, dressed in old-fashioned livery. I was surprised to see that he was a human ghost and not one of those puppet-like servants. His eyes swiveled around the empty street, then rested upon me. "What do you want?" he asked. I'm looking for—" I stammered, fool that I was. I had been so intent on the revelations of the day and the pressing need to get to the Lim mansion that I had completely forgotten to think of some pretext for entry. "For work?" he barked. "You're late. Didn't they tell you to go to the side entrance, not the main door?" Then he paused. "Or perhaps you mean the other kind of work." Leaning forward, he brought a lantern up to my face and examined it closely. "I heard you needed a kitchen maid," I said quickly. He gave me a long leer. "If you ask me, you'd be wasted there. The master's been looking for new concubines. They don't need you in the kitchen with so many puppet servants." "You mean those mannequins burned as funeral offerings?" "Hush your mouth. We don't talk about the funerals here. Nobody wants to be reminded about his death. We call them puppet men, and to the master don't refer to them at all. He doesn't like them. Any pauper can have a puppet servant or two. Even I have one. That's why at the great house they hire human ghosts as staff." "If you have your own servant, why are you working here?" I asked. "Same reason as you, sweetheart. Not enough funeral money burned for me. But why waste yourself in the kitchen?" His eyes fastened on me greedily and I began to feel afraid. I could use a wife myself. I shrank back, glancing into the shadows where I had left Jindana out of sight. If I had to, I would rather pretend to be a candidate for Lim Ching's harem than be accosted by this gatekeeper. At least I would stand a better chance of getting further into the house, but another voice rang out from within. "Who's there? Why have you left the gate open?" The gatekeeper turned suddenly to face another retainer who had appeared at the entrance. "I was just giving her directions. She wanted to go to the kitchen." "The wrong door, eh?" The second man, older and more heavyset, turned to me. "Now then, who are you?" I cast my eyes down, mumbling that I heard there was an opening for a kitchen maid. "You can do better than that," he said. "In fact, the master will be pleased to see one like you." I began a tale about having pledged true love to my fiancé, but he sighed and cut me off. "Never mind, I've heard this kind of thing before. I'm sure you'll change your mind after 20 years in the kitchen. If you have a change of heart, let me know. I'm the steward here. Make sure to address me politely when you see me." I trailed after him, avoiding the baleful glare of the gatekeeper. "Sir, I have a few possessions still outside." He barely turned his head. "I'm sure you do. Some grave goods and such. You can collect them later." And so, thankful that I had told Jindana to hide until I came back for her, I crossed the threshold of the Lim mansion. We walked a long way, down endless corridors and through countless courtyards. I glimpsed the echoing expanses of silent banquet halls and felt a shiver course down my spine. I had been here before in my dreams, those suffocating nightmares when I had been forced to wander these halls night after night and admire Lim Ching's wealth. Though puppet servants still stood blankly at attention, there was also a number of human ghosts. Some were dressed as servants, but others appeared to be guests or residents of the house. They wore the same kind of stiff, gaudy attire that I had seen Lim Ching wear, which gave the whole scene an antique air. Feeling like a complete non-entity, I scurried behind the stewards with a lowered head. After a while, the surroundings became more utilitarian. "Don't expect to come in through the main gate again," the steward said curtly without breaking her stride. "You're lucky I happened to pass by when I did." We were now rapidly approaching an outbuilding from which the clang of pots and sounds of shouted orders became discernible. It was a homely cacophony, so unexpectedly like the world of the living that I was surprised to find a lump in my throat. It had been only 2 days since I had passed into the realm of the dead, but already I longed for the noise and clatter, the living air of my own Malacca. The kitchen was a vast hall filled with servants and steam. Rows of dishes were laid out, many arranged elaborately like spirit offerings. There was a number of puppet servants, all busy chopping, frying, and steaming this bounty. If this had been like a real kitchen, the smell of oil heating, garlic and ginger being pounded, and fish frying would have assailed my nostrils, but the smells here were muted. I had to sniff hard to tease them out. The steward spoke to a large, paunchy human ghost who was in charge. After a brief conversation, he beckoned me over. "This is the new girl. Too dainty. I can't use her. Send her upstairs." "She doesn't want to do that kind of work," said the steward significantly. "I don't need another kitchen maid." "If you please, sir," I ventured, "I can also serve and wait." "There you go," said the steward. "Use her as the waitstaff. They can always do with more humans on show." The cook looked at me sceptically. "I have enough puppet waiters. At least they don't spill soup on people. I can't afford another mistake like that again." The steward rolled his eyes. "Do as you will. If you can't use her, send her to housekeeping then." When he had left, the cook regarded me with a raised brow. He had small cunning eyes above a broad, squashed nose with flaring nostrils. It was unfortunate that he was so fat. His corpulence only served to accentuate his resemblance to a pig, especially when he sank his jolly chin into his neck to regard me. "All right," he said, after an awkward silence. "I'll give you a trial, but don't come crying to me if it doesn't work. You shouldn't be here at all, and you know it." I blanched, wondering if my covert mission was so easily discerned. But he went on to say, "The steward talks tough but has a soft heart for young girls like you. He left a daughter behind, about your age, I think. Otherwise, you really should be auditioning for the master's bedchamber." He laughed coarsely, and I shrank even further into myself. "Nah, don't worry. I said you can have a trial here, but if you don't suit, then it's off with you. Plenty of ghosts wanting work nowadays, especially since the household is doing so well." I bobbed my head, thinking of an alias. "Thank you, my name is—" He cut me off with a dismissive gesture. "Don't bother, we don't use names here." Seeing my eyes widen, he shook his head. "You must have just died. Listen, all of us here came because we had descendants of some family members who bothered to burn offerings for us. We're technically the privileged ones who can spend some time enjoying the fruits of filial piety before going on to judgments at court, but some of us end up working as servants out of boredom or necessity. Still, we don't use our true names, understand? My grandchildren want to think that I'm enjoying an afterlife of leisure here, and I want to preserve that illusion, so no names." "But how would they know what you were doing here anyway?" "Tch! Of course they don't know, but we don't like to think about them getting wind of it through some spiritualist or medium. You never know what sort of information leaks out. Anyway, for our own pride, we don't mention it." I nodded obediently, wondering again at this ghost world, which seemed to have so much of the vices and failings of life. "So you can be girl number 6. Number 6? Yes, there were 5 before you. Don't ask me what happened to them. Now, go over there and start preparing that fish. I want to see you clean and steam it Teochew style, understand?" He gestured to a shining pile of pomfret, their silvery bellies slick and plump. I have an itchy nose, don't mind me. Perfect. I often helped old Wong in the kitchen, though I was mostly relegated to menial tasks like pinching the roots of bean sprouts and cleaning squid. Occasionally, however, he let me prepare dishes. Now I carefully slit a fish open to remove the guts. To my surprise, however, there was nothing inside it, only a hollow space. Setting the knife down, I examined it thoroughly. It looked like a fish, and felt like one, right down to the slippery flesh. But when I brought it to my nose, there was no smell at all, not even the clean salt tang of the ocean. Over my shoulder, I heard a burst of laughter. "Never seen a fish like this before, have you?" said the cook. "They're pretend fish, just like all the food isn't real food either. There's very little taste, so that's why the kitchen is so important. We have to do our best to make it palatable." "But I thought the offerings had flavour," I said. "Oh, they taste fine when they're fresh and received when you're in the world of the living," said the cook. "But when you cross over into the plains, they seem to lose all their savour. That's why a lot of they'd like to go visit their old haunts from time to time. It's been a long time since I had some freshly made PT or a bowl of assam laksa." He stared off into the distance for a moment. "The PT my mother made was so delicious. The outside was crisp and the turnip and prawn filling sweet yet toothsome. She used to arrange them on a plate so that they looked just like tiny crunchy top hats. And the chili sauce. My mother was famous for her chili sauce, which she pounded every morning and mixed with vinegar, garlic and sugar." Listening to him reminisce made my mouth water. I had to close it to prevent myself from drooling, and for the first time since I had arrived in the plain of the dead, I became aware of a dull hunger. This was not good. Lang had specifically warned me against eating spirit food. I bent over the fish and rinsed it in a clean bowl of water. Then I selected a shallow metal pan from a large stack of pans while the cook watched me expressionlessly with his small piggy eyes. I broke off a knob of ginger, peeled, sliced, and arranged it on the dish. After placing the cleaned pomfret on top, I added sliced tomatoes, then looked around. "The sour plums are over there," he said flatly. Under his watchful eyes, I fished out 4 or 5 plums, preserved in brine, and laid them on the fish. Using my fingers, I mashed them to spread their soft flesh like paste. "Why so many? What a waste!" "I thought I should add more because there's so little taste," I said. He nodded in satisfaction. "At least you have some brains. Remember, everything here has to be highly spiced, sometimes even double or triple what you used to use before you passed over. Otherwise the guests will complain. All right, you can stop now." My arms were lean and my shoulders ached with weariness. The cook was still talking, and I had to concentrate to follow his rapid instructions. "So get your things. You can sleep in the servants' quarters tonight. There are no other serving girls right now, so you have your own room for the moment. Now hurry up. I want you in here early tomorrow morning when the fires are lit." I looked up at him dazed. How would I find my way? "Didn't you hear me? I'll send a puppet servant out with you. You can get your grave goods and other belongings. Store them in your own room and don't bring them into the main house. They don't need your cheap clutter here. Tired, are you? It's the air of the plains. It takes some getting used to when you first get here. Go on then with you," he said. An expressionless mannequin had glided up beside him and now it took off swiftly. I suppose it was to be my guide and hurried to catch up. Lit only by dim sconces, the low, narrow passages closed in upon me like a nightmare. My guide was also horribly familiar. I had seen that bland face repeated 20 times over on various puppet servitors around the house. It walked with no need for light, silent except for the occasional loud papery rustle. I did not speak to it. Though it was formed in the semblance of a man, I could not think of it as having a gender, and it paid no more mind to me than if I had been a stray dog. Soon we arrived at a walled garden with a small bolted gate. This presumably was one of the back doors that the gatekeeper had mentioned. I had little time to wonder at my surroundings, however, for my guide trotted rapidly along the outer trim of the wall until we approached the main gate from the outside. Then it stopped. "I'll just get my things then," I said. The creature gave no sign of comprehension, but since it was clearly waiting, I hastened to find Chandana. To my relief, she was still concealed in shadows. I had asked her to hide when I had first approached the gates hours ago, and part of my anxieties since then had been here over her safety, even though I remembered Fan's words about how no one else could tamper with your grave goods unless you gave them away. Aware of my silent guide, I took her bridle and led her back with me. Our re-entry into the Lim mansion was surprisingly easy. Perhaps it was because we came through the servants' entrance, but there was no one around to comment on my horse. The puppet servant led me to a series of low outbuildings that stood behind the kitchen. These were obviously the servants' quarters for human ghosts like myself, for piles of bedding and other sundries were laid out. Across the way I could see lights and hear men's voices, but the women's quarters were silent and dark. Leading me to a small room at the end, my guide opened the door and with a stiff jerk of its head motioned me in. "Where are the kitchens?" I asked, anxious that I should find my way in the morning. Another swivel and it pointed to the bulk of the building, just visible in the gloom. Then it walked off. I was so tired that I stumbled into the low-ceilinged, dark room, obviously intended as dormitory housing for 3 or 4 servants. It was now empty and lit only by the fitful flicker of an oil lamp left by the puppet servant. I'd meant to leave Chandana outside, but the room depressed me, so not caring about propriety, I led my little horse inside. She had to duck to fit through the doorway, but her neat familiar form made me feel much better. Dragging a pallet out, I threw myself down into oblivion. "Brittany, where are you going?" Brittany's currently out. She's chilling in the corner. Don't you dare eat that pencil. What did I just say not to do? She's an idiot. Cool. Hi. I'll have some water and then we'll carry on. I woke to the sounds of clanging and scraping. It was still dark, but from the narrow window... Chapter 24, by the way. I forgot to say that. I could see a faint lightening of the sky. Recalling the cook's injunction to go to the kitchen when the fires were lit, I jumped up hastily. I patted Chindana's nose, grateful again that she was not a real horse and could be left waiting indefinitely for me. Not wishing to draw attention to her, however, I backed her into the darkest corner of the room and pulled a bamboo screen, meant to divide the servants' sleeping quarters, in front of her. The sounds I heard turned out to be 2 puppet servants who stood outside the back door of the kitchen, sluicing down large cooking pots with buckets of water. They ignored me, so I brushed past them into the large kitchen. The fires and the numerous charcoal stoves were already lit, and I had barely time to take note of my surroundings before the cook pounced on me. "You're still here?" "You told me to come in the morning," I said. "So I did. Didn't really expect you to, though." "Why not?" "Ah, girls, you know. Flighty. Didn't think you cared too much for the lodging." I blinked, realising that most ghosts who had funeral offerings probably had their own houses and might well turn up their noses at such shabby accommodations. "It's all right," I said cautiously. "Then get started." I soon realised that the cook didn't need my help for any of the menial tasks such as plucking chickens, washing vegetables, or scoring pots. He had plenty of puppet servants to do that. Instead, he used me to relay orders, keep an eye on the puppet servants, and most important, help him taste and season the dishes. Breakfast was being prepared for an unknown number of guests, and we were busy with cauldrons of rice congee laced with sliced raw fish, fried fritters, and scalds of soft-boiled eggs nestled in little bowls with soy sauce and pepper. It was when I was directing a puppet servant to make kaya toast that I really felt tempted to eat. The thick slices of bread were toasted over a bed of charcoal on a wire net until they turned crispy golden. "What are you doing?" When done, they were smeared lavishly with butter and kaya, a custard-like jam made from caramelised eggs, sugar and pandan leaves. Unthinkably, I brought a smeared finger to my lips, then stopped, reminded of Lang's injunction. With a stab of panic, I realised that I had no way of knowing how long I'd have to stay here, or how much time had passed in the real world. Lang had said that time often passed at a different rate in the plains of the dead, and my anxious thoughts flew back to my comatose body, so far away from me. "You don't have to frown so much. Breakfast is almost done." The cook's voice made me jump. "Aya, such a pampered miss like you. Just give up. Go home." "I'm fine." He gave me a sceptical glance. "Anyway, my other helper should be back tomorrow." "Your other helper?" "You don't think I do this all by myself all the time, do you? She's the one who usually helps supervise the puppets, but she ran aloof with the second wife and got boiling soup thrown on her. That woman is really a piece of work. Pretty as they come, but a bitch when she opens her mouth." Sorry. Who is she?" "The second wife? She's the old master's bit of skirt. I thought the master of the house was quite young." "The old master was 72 when he died. You must be talking about the young master." "How can there be 2 masters here? I thought that each home was burned as a funeral offering for an individual." "Sure, but it doesn't mean that they can't combine them. It's true that most of the wealth came from the young master when he passed over, but this was already a great house before. The old mister is Lim Tian Ching's great uncle. I don't know what happened to the grandfather. Probably already went on the courts of hell." Why is she barking? The Lim family seat was represented by the great uncle until the young man died, and what a fortune he brought. His parents spared no expense on his funeral, I tell you. In any case, his great uncle and he joined households. More convenient, I suppose, but the young master is hardly here anyway. Now that the breakfast rush was over, the cook ladled himself a steaming bowl of rice congee. He sprinkled cilantro and shredded ginger on top and doused it with soy sauce and sesame oil. "What?" he said, catching my gaze. You can eat too if you want, no shortage of food here. I drew a stool up near him and pretended to pick at a fritter. Is he here now? Why do you want to know? I'm just curious. I heard he's young, about my age. Want to marry him? What? No. The cook laughed curiously. Come off it. There are marriages arranged in the spirit world every day, and your fiancé won't even have to know about it. I shook my head vigorously, but the cook mistook my agitation for shyness. You might change your mind. He's quite a catch. Isn't he married already? Who? The young master? Not yet, though they were making arrangements just the other day. A whole banquet hall done up with red lanterns and lots of food. I blanched, remembering the dream in which I had found myself along with Lim Ching in the spectral hall of red lanterns. That was where he had pressed me about the marriage and I had fled, forcing myself awake through the coiling mists of his dream world. But the cook was chattering away. It was supposed to be an engagement party. He was in a terrible temper after that, though. I think the bride didn't show up. She didn't? If you ask me, I heard she was alive. Can you imagine the cheek of that fellow? Even the judges of hell don't take too kindly to such marriages. Oh, they might make an exception if the deceased and the living were in love, but in general it just proved to everyone how much favour Lim Ching has carried with him. I pricked my ears up at this. How is he on such good terms with them? Oh, I'm very out of frame. There we go. Beats me. He placed one finger on the side of his nose and gave me a sly grin. I'll say no more, though, if I want to keep my place. Ah, the rich get richer and the poor get trampled down. It was the same when I was alive. The cook had emptied his bowl of porridge and pushed himself away from the table. Since you're here, go and take some breakfast to my assistant. I'd send a puppet, but they're busy right now. He glanced at the courtyard, where 3 puppet servants were busily butchering an enormous pig. Unlike a real pig, however, it stood motionless while the mannequins dismembered it. Even as they carved off ham and shoulders, the pig showed no reaction. Neither did it bleed. As I watched, one of the servants whacked off the heavy head. Do you mind? Give me a sec. Come here. Come on. You okay? We have a guest. Leaving it blinking placidly on the flagstones. Suppressing a shudder, I picked up a tray with a bowl of congee and a teapot. Her room is so close to yours, but it's a single, not a dormitory, said the cook. Hurry up, I want you back here so that we can start lunch. I made my way out through the courtyard, averting my eyes from the bloodless porcine slaughter that was still going on. Even if Lang hadn't warned me against eating food here, this would have permanently put me off. Where are you going? Okay. Goodbye. Unlike the food that old Wong had offered me, this pig must have been a paper funeral effigy. No wonder the cook here complained constantly about tastelessness. As I wended my way to the servants' quarters, I concentrated on not spilling, sorry babe, the scalding porridge. My wrists began to ache, and I began to understand why the cook had been so dismissive of me initially. No doubt it took strength to carry the food such great distances to the banquet hall. When I reached my quarters, I glanced around. Last night it had been so dark that I hadn't noticed any inhabitants, but spotting another door, I made my way towards it. It was silent in the courtyard, and the light had a blank brightness, so that the shadows lay on the paving stones like crisp paper cutouts. Setting the tray down, I knocked cautiously. The stillness convinced me that no one was there, so I was startled to hear a voice call out. Who are you? I sighed. In my brief existence parted from my flesh, I was invariably greeted with a lack of ceremony. Perhaps it was less a function of this ghost world than that I was now wandering that I was now a wandering spirit. No better than a beggar, really. "I'm the new girl?" I said. "I've brought you breakfast." The door opened and a tiny old woman came out. At first glance I was so startled. So striking was her resemblance to Amma. She too had a bird-like figure, bright dark eyes and grey hair scraped into a bun. A closer look, however, revealed that her features were different, the eyes larger, the nose a little higher. Still, like Amma, she was dressed in the ubiquitous black and white uniform, and the general impression, coupled with age, was remarkably similar. She could have been Amma's older sister. As I got over my shock, I realised that the old woman was also staring at me. "What's your name?" she asked. "I'm girl number 6, I said, remembering the cook's injunction against my name. "But who is your family?" "My surname is Chen," I said, cursing the perpetual nosiness of old ladies. The last thing I wanted was for rumours of my background to get around the owner of this house. "Chen?" she said. "I wonder whether you're related to any of my friends." "Oh, probably not, Auntie," I said, addressing her politely. "My family was from Negri Sembilan. We just moved to Malacca before I died." She nodded absently. "There's a folding table inside. Can you bring it out for me?" I glanced down, registering that her forearms were wrapped in bandages. "What happened to you, Auntie?" "It's nothing, just some burns." Catching my eye, her mouth quirked. "Injuries heal faster here than in the living world." "Does it hurt?" "Yes, but as there's no infection here, there's no risk of gangrene. After all, we're already dead." This was the second time she had alluded to death in our brief conversation, and it seemed contrary to general aversions to talking about one's demise among the ghosts. "It must have been a bad accident," I said. She snorted. "Accident? The second wife threw soup at me. She was in one of her moods the other day. You do well to stay away from her." I went inside and brought out a rickety folding table and stool. It was a small room, far smaller than mine, though my quarters were, of course, designed as a dormitory for multiple servants. Though threadbare, it was scrupulously clean. There was nothing but a sleeping pallet, a wooden chest, and a few neatly folded clothes. Outside, I set up the table and stool with her breakfast. "You don't have to wait on me," she said. "I don't mind," I said truthfully. There was something about this old woman that made me feel comfortable. It might have been her resemblance to Amma, or simply that, despite her initial wariness, she seemed friendly. "The cook isn't too bad," she said as she began to eat. "He's a bit coarse, but he won't try to use you, unlike some others." "How long have you been here?" "A long time. It's hard to tell in a place like this." "And you?" I spun her the same story that I had given the cook about needing work and not having any place to stay. She nodded briefly. "If you want to stay in the kitchens and out the master's bedchamber, you'd better run along now. The cook gets impatient, but don't worry. Tell him that I'll be back at work soon." I hastened back to the kitchen, suddenly anxious about having been away for so long. I wanted to ask the old woman more about the mysterious second wife who had scalded her. In my heart, however, I had a sinking feeling that I knew who she was. Back in the kitchen, the carcass of the pig had already been disposed of into neatly butchered chunks. The head, thankfully, was nowhere to be seen. Though gazing at a few enormous pots, I hoped that the cook wouldn't ask me to lift their lids to stir. Fortunately, he was otherwise occupied. The lunch rush had already begun, and he was shouting at the puppet servants who were washing, chopping, and stir-frying vigorously. I made my way timidly over to him and apologised for being late. "Next time, don't get lost," he said without glancing at me. Then, "How is she?" "The old lady? You can call her Auntie 3. Everyone does. She's the third one we've had, at least that I know of." "She said she'd be able to work soon." He turned. "At least she didn't go blind. I thought for sure the soup would scald her face." "Why did she do it? The second wife? No reason. Boredom, maybe. She's like that. If she wasn't so beautiful, I think the old master would have gotten rid of her a long time ago. But there's something about her. Maybe because I'm a man. But even I feel like I couldn't refuse her anything, if she jumped into my bed." He gave a coarse laugh and told me to start checking the dishes. "That's usually Auntie 3's job. Let's see how well you do." Pardon me. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, though each morning I donned on Alma's uniform of plain white blouse and black cotton trousers. I discovered that by evening I'd be wearing my own clothes again. Perhaps this was because the uniform was only borrowed, unlike my pyjamas that renewed themselves and reminded me that Alma was still caring for my body somewhere in the real Malacca. Nevertheless, I slipped Erlang's scales into the pocket of whatever I wore. It was of no practical use here, but its cool weight gave me some comfort. The work in the kitchen was unendingly monotonous in the absence of smell. Without aroma, the food passed before me like wax models. I tried to press the cook for more information about the family, but he gave me only dribs and drabbles. The steward would probably have been a better source, but he was always in a hurry when he came to the kitchen and ignored me. With only a few days left until I had promised to meet Fan, I regretted not taking some other job within the Lim household. If I were a waiter or a cleaner instead, I would have an excuse to eavesdrop in the main house. As it was, I felt a gnawing sense of frustration and anxiety with each passing day. On the third day, Auntie Three came back to work despite the bandages on her hand. The cook was quite astonished to see her. "Why so surprised?" she said. "I told you I'd be back soon." "Yeah, well, I didn't think you really meant it. What did you expect me to do, sit in my room and look at the wall?" He shrugged, but insisted on seeing her arms. "It's all healed, I tell you," she said, but when the cook peeled back one of the corners of the bandages, I winced at the sight. Her skin was flayed where she had been scalded, though the wounds were bloodless and absent of any colour or pus. "I don't think you should be working here. Yet," he said. "If you're worried about her, I know how to keep her out of her way," she said, turning away. I watched her bird-like movements with a mixture of pity and curiosity. That small, stubborn figure clad in black and white reminded me of Alma in so many ways that my homesickness was almost palpable. My chance came 2 days later. During the evening meal, the steward suddenly appeared in the kitchen. "Another steamed fish, quick!" he hissed. "What happened?" Puppet servant collided with another. "Now we're missing a course, and the master has guests." "Guests?" asked Auntie Three, coming up behind the cook. The steward started at this interruption. "Oh, it's you. I'd ask you to serve, but you know what happened last time, and she's not in a good mood tonight." "What kind of guests?" asked Auntie Three again. "You know," he said, a glance flickering between the three of them. "None of the puppets here have been trained to wait on guests. Aren't there any others outside?" asked the cook. "We're low on servers. Some of them were damaged during the last banquet and haven't been replaced yet." "I'll do it," I said. They turned to look at me. "No," said Auntie Three, but she was interrupted by the steward. "I forgot about you." He gave me a measured look. "Yes, you might do. She has no idea how to behave. It's not so formal tonight. Only the old master is present. The young master is still away." Pulse racing, I smoothed my apron and reiterated my willingness to serve. "All right," said the steward at last, "but be quick. We're between courses and I asked the musicians to play first." Grasping my elbow, he propelled me out the kitchen, muttering instructions. "The puppet servants will bring the food from the kitchen to the sideboard. I'll present the main dishes at the table. You stand on the side to arrange individual portions and keep an eye on the puppet servant for me. This batch is unreliable. Hopefully it won't be necessary for you to approach the tables. Understand?" I nodded. Then, fearing he could not see me in the dim corridor, added, "Yes, sir," for good measure. I was itching to ask him who the guests were, but he looked so preoccupied that I held my tongue. The saving grace was that Lim Ting Ching, the young master, was not here. Oh, wow, don't know what that accent was. Though by this point I was so desperate to do some spying that I might have braved his presence anyway. As we walked swiftly down the corridors, I kept my eyes open for possible hiding places. I had tried to sneak into the main house before, but the cook always locked the great kitchen door at night. Now that I was on the other side, perhaps I could find a place to conceal myself before he did so. The banquet room was lit with dozens of oil lamps. A trio of puppet musicians were performing. 2 erhu players and 1 yanquin player accompanying them. The sight set a shiver through me. The last time I had seen live musicians had been at the Double Seventh Festival at the real Lim Mansion in Malacca, and there we had been entertained by such a trio as well. As well I remembered, Tian Bei had been one of the musicians. What was it about this ghost world that seemed to create uncanny parallels with the living? I thought of Auntie Three in the kitchen and how much she reminded me of Amma, and wondered whether these coincidences were intentional or merely part of peculiar synchronicity between the two places. I had little time to reflect upon this before I was huddled to a serving station by the steward. The guests were in the midst of eating, and I could see by the stacks of dishes on the sideboard that it was a lengthy feast. Hissing some final instructions to me, the steward hastily made his way to the largest table with the steamed fish. He set it upon the table with a flourish and deftly deboned it for the waiting diners with much smiling and bowing. This must be the head table, I decided, for him to serve them first, and I craned my head to see its occupants. There were 10 figures seated there, 2 of them enormous enough to dwarf the other diners. With a sinking sensation, I recognised the humped, hulking form and sweeping tines of an ox-headed demon. I'm going to stop reading there because it's been a few hours? An hour and a half? So I don't know when I'm going to next stream again. But hopefully soon. I'll put it up on my Instagram when I'm going to stream beforehand. So go follow me there. I hope that you enjoyed this part, and we'll find out what happens next in my next stream. Yeah. Bye. See you next time. Bye.